how we can use csv.reader, csv.writer, csv.reader, and csv.writer to read CSV files. First, why don't we just do what we did in the intro class and what perhaps some of you have done in other situations as well, and just go ahead and process the line the way we're normally used to doing it. We could split on a comma. We would end up getting a name. We'd end up getting the fields. And why wouldn't that be preferable if we can do it? Well, the CSV, for one thing, the CSV module handles that for us. So instead of stripping the line, which removes a new line from the line, right, and splitting, we can just have CSV do this. What we do is we create a reader object and then pass the reader, pass the file handle to it. And then we loop through the reader object. Now, when we loop through the reader object, we find that each row is no longer a line. It's actually a row, a list, really. We could call it row list. And this is what we get when we loop through the reader object. In other words, CSV is handling this for us. Now, as I explained, the main reason for this is that if a company should have a comma in the data, the split on a comma would not work. Splitting on a comma means that we're expecting the comma to be structural. And if you look at a file like this one, you can see that there are 2 commas per line. This would be perfect for split because splitting on a comma would always divide the line into 3 parts, and those 3 parts would always be the same: the file name, the state abbreviation, and the revenue value. But what if the value for one of the fields had a comma in it? As you can see, this line has 3 commas. Well, doing a comma split on this line would render 4 items instead of 3, and so then the algorithm would be completely thrown off. In that way, we could say, you know, if all else being equal, that this file is corrupted. It does not have the integrity that we need to expect from a CSV file. But the way the CSV specification, file specification, handles the situation of a comma in a field is by putting quotes around the field, indicating to the reader that this is a single field and that they should not consider the comma to be structural. It is instead part of the data. This is how the CSV specification manages this kind of situation. Now, we could, if we were going to be doing the splitting ourselves, we could probably figure out a way to see whether or not a field has quotes around it, but it would be rather awkward and a lot more work than we probably should have to undertake. So the CSV module was created to manage that situation. And if we were to have fields with commas in them, the CSV module would manage that. It would notice. It just does all that little internal work for us. This is the classic way in which a module really makes our lives easier. It manages certain things that would be really kind of annoying and complicated for us to figure out, and just makes them quite easy. So this is the main argument for using the CSV reader, is that it understands the CSV specification probably better than we would want to have to spend time to do, and it will handle the cells for us. This is how the reader works. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the reader, or really about any file, is that we may notice that the first row in this file is the header row. we probably don't want to have to handle this in the same way that we handle each of the other lines. Each of the other lines is perfect for a for loop because we're likely to do something with each line. For instance, sum up the float values or pull out all the states and add them to a set or anything else that we might do with all the lines of the file. But this line is different. This line is not data. This line is actually giving us information but not data. So what we would generally do then is pull out the header from it by calling next on the reader object. The reader object is something we call an iterator. It remembers what happened to it. If we call next on the reader, what we get then is a list of the headers, which is company, state, and I cannot type. Company, state, and what was it? Price, I think. And having pulled this header from the reader, since this reader actually remembers its state, it remembers where it was, once we start looping through, and I can run this, we'll get only the data. And we get each of these with just the data. Before we did that, we were getting the header in the loop. And although we could manage it in the loop perhaps, it would be very awkward to do that. We'd have to say, oh, is this the first iteration? If it's the first iteration, do this. If it's not the first iteration, do that. And that's not something we necessarily have to do. Instead, we'll call next. We'll get that first row. And now when we loop, we'll find that it starts on the data. It starts on the second line. So that is standard on how we would use the reader. Now, if we wanted to use a csv.writer, we have a similar set of conveniences. That is, we don't really have to do too much to build a CSV file that matches the CSV spec, except use the CSV module. So maybe what we'd like to do is write this file back to a new file. We could make some sort of change to it if we wish. We could capitalize all of the first names or something like that, I suppose. And if we were to do that, we would probably want to begin by, well, we would definitely want to pass the write file to a csv.writer. Of course, you notice that I'm putting this write file. Oh, and by the way, is it delimiter equals empty string? Is that what it is? Or no, new line equals empty string. Oh shoot, I think I'm going to have to look it up so that I don't mislead you. But let's do some CSV writing. Okay. Yeah, new line equals empty. I think I mentioned this, but I'll mention it again. This new line equals empty is necessary for Windows users because otherwise I think Windows gets confused and you'll end up with an extra blank line in between every line that you write. So that's why this needs to be there. It's benign, so you can do it on the Mac or Linux, but it's not going to have an effect. So now let's just imagine that we wanted to write to the CSV, the new CSV file that we're building here. I'm just taking the header off of the first line of the read file and I'm writing it to the write file. And by the way, although you can build up what you want to write into a list or something, in many cases it's probably not necessary. You can just go ahead and write as you're writing. Now since this is a list, I'm going to do something a little unconventional. I'm going to say let's let the first item of the list be equal to the first item of the list uppercased, and then let's write that row to the new CSV file. Now what we've done is we've opened up simultaneously a read file and a write file. We built a reader object and a writer object, and then after writing the header from the read object to the write object, we're now looping through the reader object, making a change to the row, and then writing that changed value to the file. And then hopefully what we'll see is that all of the company names have been uppercased and that it's an otherwise identical file. One thing to keep in mind anytime you're writing is to remember to close the file, and don't do what a lot of students have done without realizing there's no way to know if you made a mistake because the file ends up closing when the script exits anyway. But I've had a number of students call the close method this way. But really, after a time, you'll come to realize that it's not a method call unless you put parentheses. So this close really does have to happen with a write file, and it's an important habit to have, because although the script is about to exit and we're going to close the file then, and these files do get closed automatically when the script exits. We want to get in the habit of closing a write file because we may find in the future find ourselves in a situation where the script does not exit right away. And in those cases, we definitely want to close the file as soon as we're done writing it. So running this should work, unless I made some error. And the result of this should be found in new file, which appears right here. And it gives us the very same CSV file, except that we've made a change to one of the fields, and so we've basically changed how the file looks. So that's kind of cool. Now in the homeworks, there's plenty of things that you're being asked to do. One of them is to maybe write a more narrow file, or maybe selectively write to a file. Well, not too difficult. It's easy enough to make a change to row list, whatever change you need to make. You could add a column. You could change one of the columns. You could remove columns and build a new list. Here's an example of me building a new list. I'll say narrow list equals row list 0 and row list 2. Just for example, and I'll make a list out of that. Now I have a list of 2 items, right? This would be Haddad's Inc. and 239.50, and I'm making a new narrow list. And now if I change that to narrow list, now I'm writing just 2 of the fields to the new file, and I should find that the new file has just the 2 fields now. Oh, except I forgot to do that with the header. So this is the CSV reader and the CSV writer. And in the next video, I'll talk about the CSV dict reader.